this lecture, we'll talk about moral arguments as it appears in Vaughn's chapter on moral reasoning in bioethics. In this lecture, I'm just going to try to familiarize you with three basic logic topics here. So fundamental elements of an argument, different types of arguments, and then what counts as a moral argument. There are three sort of fundamental elements of an argument. First, you have statements, and these are just sentences that make an assertion about truth or falsity, right? The sky is blue, that's a statement. My car is gray. Then there are premises. These are statements that are specifically made in support of a conclusion. So if you're trying to give an argument, you're trying to give these premises that ultimately make a logical thread that lead to a conclusion. And so the conclusion is a statement that posits the argument's main point. So if we're looking at just an example here, imagine we have this quarter, right? And I were to give you this argument. If I flip this coin, then it will land as either heads or tails. I flip the coin and it is not tails. Therefore, I can tell you for sure that it's going to be heads. Right. So what we have here in the simplest terms, we have two premises, these first two statements here. If I flip this coin, then it will land as either heads or tails. That's a statement. It's a conditional statement if you care. And if you're really interested in this very short lecture, then I suggest that you take logic. It's a lot of fun. But for our purposes here in this course, you don't have to really be too familiar with all the different concepts, but it's important when we're talking about moral arguments. We'll see people who say we should reject this premise, we should reject this conclusion because the premises don't follow. It's important to be able to understand what the different components are that we're talking about here. So we have these two premises. I read the first one and then for some reason went on a tangent to not mention the second one, which is I flipped the coin and it is not tails. So those are our two premises, and then we have our conclusion here. So those are the basic components of an argument. We have statements, we have premises, and we've got a conclusion. Now let's differentiate between two different types of arguments. So we have deductive arguments on the one hand and inductive arguments on the other. So deductive argument is called truth preserving or top down, insofar as if the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows. And so let's look at this example. I'm using just some simple logic notation here. P's mean premises, C means conclusion. So if I gave you this argument that the interior angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, that's just a rule of geometry, that's the system. The second premise being that I know two of the angles and they're both 60 degrees. That means I can conclude that the third angle is 60 degrees. So if you ever did geometrical proofs in high school, that's a type of deductive argument. On the other hand, inductive arguments are inferential and probabilistic. We also call them bottom-up, meaning that you have to piece the different things together. These are not necessarily truth-preserving because sometimes you can have strong premises and a strong argument that doesn't necessarily end up being true in the end. So let me give you another example. So if I were to tell you that if it rains, then I take my umbrella, there's an 80% chance of rain. That's our second premise. Therefore, I will take my umbrella. You might think that that is a pretty strong argument because I have a pretty good understanding that it might rain today, that it's an 80% chance. That's a pretty solid evidence or probability to just justify me taking my umbrella. But if it ends up not raining, then it seems like I violated my first premise, which is if it rains, then I take my umbrella. So inductive arguments are different from deductive ones because the conclusion doesn't always follow from the premises, but we can still evaluate the arguments based on these probabilities that are end up making us believe that either the argument is strong or weak. Finally, let's talk about the important aspect of this lecture, is like what counts as a moral argument. I just gave you two arguments on the previous screen that have nothing to do about what's right and wrong. A moral argument requires that there's at least some moral premise that makes an assertion, a statement that says that something is right or wrong. So a moral argument, as defined here, is an argument whose conclusion is a moral statement, an assertion that an action is right or wrong, or a person is good or bad. And if we don't have a moral premise, then we cannot actually legitimately arrive at a moral conclusion. So let me give you another example here. Imagine that I have my car, and my friend John ends up stealing my car. I can have this premise that John stole my car. I make the conclusion that John is a bad friend. This is actually not a moral argument. It's just a statement of certain facts, or I guess the first premise is a statement of effect. There's no actual moral premise going on here that leads us to derive that conclusion. Instead, imagine if we insert a moral premise. Let's say the first premise is John stole my car, and our moral premise here would be stealing a friend's car is wrong. Wrong is a type of value claim. And so now we can derive the conclusion that John is a bad person. This counts as a moral argument because it has that moral premise in it. And then we derive our moral conclusion from it. So that's the key difference between what counts as a moral argument and what's just a typical logical argument. We'll be most considered with moral arguments throughout this course. And so what we'll be trying to critique are these moral premises, or how the logic within these arguments gets us from the premises to the conclusion. Finally, one of the terms that you'll see throughout our readings is this idea of a considered moral judgment. A considered moral judgment is just the type of moral judgment that we think is plausible or credible after we have been reflecting on it in the most unbiased way possible. That to think about the example of murder as an act again, right? We have a considered moral judgment that murder is wrong because we've reflected on it, and this moral judgment is a result of this unbiased rationalization that we've done. So this is what counts as a moral argument. I know this lecture has been quite brief, but let's just summarize the key points. So arguments are comprised of statements that include premises in support of a conclusion. We have the difference between a deductive argument and an inductive argument. So deductive arguments are truth preserving insofar as that the conclusion necessarily follows. It's necessarily true as long as the premises are true, if it's a valid argument. If it's an invalid one, then the form and structure of the argument should be rejected. Again, if you're interested in this, please do sign up for the logic course. Inductive arguments rely on probabilities to ultimately infer the conclusion. So these are a little bit more inferential in their nature. And so that's the difference between inductive and deductive argument. But for our interests in this course, moral arguments require a moral premise. So when we're evaluating different moral arguments as either ones that we should accept or reject, we're trying to discover or identify what the moral premise is and then see how the premises connect with one another to justify the conclusion. And then finally, whenever you see the phrase considered moral judgments, just know that those are the sort of moral judgments that we deem as plausible after we have given some critical reflection to